But Tom, as I've said before, right, whether you like them or not, death taxes net zero 2050, that is the seeming inevitability here. But no one is able to turn around and answer that question about cost of transition. They all just pretend the transition has happened and nothing happens in the middle. Didn't Australia have an experience in the 90s and the early 2000s of this little thing called globalisation?
Yes, they did, but I've got a slightly different way of looking at this. Look, Australia's just committed to buying anywhere between 8 and 12 or 16 nuclear submarines, and already polls are saying that people are perhaps, on average, okay with nuclear power. I have a funny feeling that Scott Morrison's going to come out and say, well, you know what, we have committed to, net zero by 2050 and whichever reduction target he agrees with by 2030, and guess what? It involves nuclear power. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's where we end up in the next few years, that they're building a case and they'll say, well, look, we've committed to this target and the only way to achieve it is nuclear reactors. And by the way, we're already building nuclear submarines, so why not go the whole hog? I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that, look, if that's the political 1-2 punch, then I think that's the way to sell it. Gleeso, again, I'm not arguing about the target. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Bronwyn, but I'm talking about the cost of. You can't square it. Australians have made it very clear for a long time about cost of. And you can say, 10 jobs over here, but what about the 10 jobs over there? There are people of a certain age who you assume don't transition. Are those people just roadkill because, the world's decided this is what's going to happen?
This is a big challenge for Scott Morrison, and you can imagine being a fly on the wall on Sunday at that National Party meeting, because there are people like Matt Canavan and Keith Pitt and Barnaby Joyce who are on the ground all the time talking to miners, talking to farmers who are going to be impacted by this. And there's a couple of seats up there in central Queensland, Flynn, Capricornia, Dawson, Herbert, full of miners. And they voted for Scott Morrison at the last election because they didn't trust Dodgy Bill. Right, now, if he goes over to Glasgow and basically mimics Dodgy Bill's policy, Scott Morrison's in a lot of strife in Queensland, because I can tell you now, if they don't win Queensland, they don't win the election. And let's not forget too, Paul, 80% of Australia's current electricity output comes from coal-fired power stations. This is not a binary argument. We have to ensure that we get... And I think Tom's absolutely nailed it. There's no doubt that nuclear is on the agenda. And Keith Pitt, the Resources Minister, has been talking about it for the last 3 years. It's a very, very good option.
But I do want to say this, though, which is every state in the country, including the Queensland government, went to elections with net zero targets or with 50-50 renewable energy targets, right? They are the instrumentalities that end up providing the regulatory framework for the power stations. So, Bronwyn, is it not different than it was 3 years ago, 6 years ago, 9 years ago, that in many ways cover has been given by the states, and it hasn't been the massive election issue at the states when they're the ones actually making decisions about power grids?
No, Paul, that's not right. Palaszczuk, to win the last election, she absolutely flipped over and supported Adani, having been against it and against it and against it. She knew if she was against Adani, she'd lose. In New South Wales, we have a problem. It's called Matt Keane. And the worry is he's got his hands on the Treasury, and I've said that before. The problem for the federal government is every time we have been to the polls and we have stood firm and said we put Australia first, because if we commit to zero emissions by 2050, it cannot be done in Australia. It cannot be done. The technology does not exist unless trillions of dollars are to be spent to reorganise the grid, for starters. I read the pro-green magazines. You will find articles in there that will explain technical difficulties to you about inertia and how that is necessary in the grid to keep the lights on and to keep power going. And they'll say that's only brought about by the spinning turbines of coal-fired power stations. There are so many parts of the argument that are just too difficult to put into the common text for people to talk about. But at the end of the day, there is no technology to get to zero emissions. There is no way that we can do that and protect jobs and protect Australia. We do not have nuclear power. And Tom, I love your idea about saying we'll get it and we'll have it, whatever. That's terrific. I'd love to see it happen. For starters, it would need for the Prime Minister to say he will repeal the provisions that were passed by the Howard government, which banned.
But isn't that the mandate he might try to seek?
Start. He may try, but he says, on the other hand, we can only do it if it's bipartisan. Well, it's never going to be bipartisan. The problem is this: we've got to consider Australia's interests first, and there is no way in the world we can go to zero emissions because the ability does not exist. There is no way you can produce power from wind and solar, but you can't store it. There's no way you can have a base load that keeps the lights on, that keeps air conditioning running, that keeps manufacturing going. And if you ask the question of the Australian people, would you be happy to commit to this nil emissions mantra if you understood that that there is less money to be spent on schools and hospitals? Would you say yes to that?
Well, of course. And I've showed the polling.
But that's the reality of it.
No, correct. But I've shown the polling all the way through about cost of, and that people won't do the transition. So I agree. How it is discussed, how it is put, affects the politics. I think that, again, the step back about the politics is nuclear the 1-2 punch, because costs are not going to be being argued by either major party, which might produce those issues for the more than 10% of people in the minor parties.